You sit down in a chair. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just a simple ordinary action you've performed thousands of times without thinking. Your body settles, your muscles relax, and from your point of view, the world becomes still. You might look at your phone, open a laptop, or simply stare into space. Everything feels calm, uneventful. But here is where things become interesting, because that sense of stillness is, in a very real physical sense, an illusion. Inside your body, nothing has stopped. Your heart is still beating, pushing blood through a vast network of arteries and veins. Your lungs are still moving air in and out. Trillions of cells are carrying out chemical reactions, exchanging signals, adjusting to tiny changes in their environment. Even the smallest structures inside you are active, dynamic, constantly shifting. So we have a contradiction. You feel still, but physically you are not still at all. Now let's try to understand this more clearly with a simple mental picture. Imagine a system of soft, flexible tubes running throughout your body. These tubes are not rigid like metal pipes. They can stretch, contract, bend, and respond to what's happening inside them. Through these tubes flows a thick, living fluid, your blood. Now imagine observing this system under two different conditions. In the first condition, you are walking. Your legs are moving, muscles are contracting and relaxing rhythmically. Each contraction gently squeezes the blood vessels, helping push blood forward. The flow becomes lively, changing moment to moment. Speeds increase, decrease, shift. It's dynamic, almost like traffic in a busy city, where movement never settles into a dull pattern. In the second condition, you are sitting. Your muscles are mostly quiet. There is no regular squeezing action from your legs. The blood still moves, because the heart is still pumping, but the character of that movement changes. It becomes more uniform, less varied, less responsive to sudden shifts. The tubes are the same, the blood is the same, the heart is the same, but the conditions are different. And in physics, conditions matter. A system can behave completely differently under slightly altered conditions, even if all its parts remain unchanged. Water can flow smoothly or become turbulent. Air can move gently or form chaotic vortices. The behavior depends not just on what something is, but on how it is being driven. Your arteries are no different. They are not passive objects. They are constantly responding to the nature of the flow inside them. When the flow changes, even subtly, the environment those artery walls experience also changes. And this is the beginning of the real story. Because when you sit down, you are not just changing your posture. You are changing the physical conditions inside a living, responsive system, and that system begins to react, quietly, continuously, in ways you cannot feel. We often imagine blood flow as something simple, like water moving through a pipe. It's a comforting image, clean, predictable, easy to understand, but it's also deeply misleading. Blood is not water, and your arteries are not pipes. Blood is a dense, crowded mixture. It contains red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, proteins, nutrients, waste products, all suspended in a liquid called plasma. It behaves less like a simple fluid and more like a constantly shifting suspension where components interact, collide, and influence one another. Now think about the walls of your arteries. They are not smooth, lifeless surfaces. They are lined with a delicate layer of living cells known as the endothelium. This layer is incredibly thin, almost unimaginably so, but it plays a crucial role. It doesn't just sit there passively. It senses, it responds, it communicates. To understand what this means, imagine standing in a shallow river. You can feel the water moving past your legs. If the current is strong, you feel pressure. If it slows, that sensation changes. You are aware of the movement without needing to see it. The cells lining your arteries experience something similar, except instead of your legs, it's their entire surface, and instead of water, it's blood sliding past them. This sliding motion creates a force along the surface of the cells, not a pushing force directly inward like pressure, but a dragging force along the wall. In physics, this is called shear stress. It's a subtle idea, but an important one. If you place your hand flat on a table and push it straight down, that's pressure. But if you slide your hand across the surface, that's shear. The direction of the force is different, and that difference matters. Inside your arteries, blood exerts both kinds of forces. But shear stress is especially important because it carries information about how the blood is flowing. Is it moving quickly or slowly, smoothly or irregularly? Is the flow steady, or does it vary with movement? The endothelial cells can feel these differences, and more than that, they respond to them. When blood flows in a dynamic, varying way, speeding up, slowing down, changing patterns, the shear stress tends to be higher and more complex. In response, these cells release substances that help the artery stay relaxed and flexible. One of the most important of these is nitric oxide, a molecule that signals the surrounding muscle to loosen, allowing the vessel to widen. This is not a conscious process. There's no decision-making in the way we think of it. It's a physical and chemical response shaped by millions of years of evolution in an environment where movement was constant. But when the flow becomes slower and more uniform, something changes. The shear stress decreases. The variation disappears. The signals the cells receive become weaker, less informative. It's as if the environment becomes quiet, not silent, but lacking in stimulation. And the cells react differently. They produce less nitric oxide. Their behavior shifts. Not dramatically, not instantly, but measurably. This is the key idea. Blood flow is not just about delivering oxygen and nutrients. It is also a form of communication between the moving fluid and the living walls of your arteries. The force of the flow carries information. The cells interpret that information, and their response influences the state of the entire vessel. So when the nature of the flow changes, even slightly, the message changes, and the arteries listen. Now we come to the central idea, the one that quietly connects everything we've been building toward. As blood moves through your arteries, it doesn't just passively travel from one place to another. It interacts with the vessel walls in a very specific physical way. It drags along them. This dragging force has a name: shear stress. At first glance, it seems like a technical detail, the kind of thing you might safely ignore. But in reality, it's one of the most important signals your arteries ever receive. To understand it properly, forget biology for a moment and think like a physicist. Imagine a deck of cards stacked neatly on a table. Now place your hand on the top card and gently push it sideways. The top card moves, the one beneath it moves a little less, and so on down the stack. Each layer slides relative to the one below it. This is shear. It's not about pushing inward or outward. It's about layers moving past each other. Fluids behave in a similar way. When a liquid flows through a tube, the layer right next to the wall moves more slowly, almost sticking to the surface, while the layers toward the center move faster. This creates a gradient of speeds from the wall to the center. That gradient produces shear stress along the wall. Now bring this back to your arteries. Blood flowing through them creates exactly this kind of layered motion. The cells lining the artery sit right at the boundary where this gradient is most pronounced. They are, in a sense, sitting at the interface between stillness and motion. And that's where the information is richest. If the flow is fast, the difference in speed between layers is larger. The shear stress increases. The cells feel a stronger dragging force. If the flow is slow, the gradient becomes gentler. The shear stress decreases. The signal weakens. But it's not just about speed. It's about variation. Imagine two rivers. One flows steadily, at the same speed, in the same direction, with no change. The other speeds up, slows down, swirls slightly around bends, responds to obstacles. Even if their average speeds are similar, the second river carries far more information in its motion. Your arteries evolved in the second kind of environment. When you move, walk, stretch, shift your weight, blood flow becomes irregular in a healthy way. It pulses more strongly. It changes direction slightly at branch points. The shear stress rises and falls, creating a dynamic signal. The endothelial cells respond to this dynamic signal. By maintaining a certain state, they release chemicals that keep the vessel open, flexible, and resistant to unwanted buildup. It's as if they interpret variation as a sign that everything is functioning normally. Now consider what happens when that variation disappears. If you sit still for a long time, the flow becomes more uniform. The pulses are still there, your heart hasn't stopped, but the additional variations created by muscle movement are reduced. The system becomes simpler, quieter. And here's the subtle point. The cells don't just respond to the presence of flow, they respond to the character of flow. A steady, unchanging signal is not the same as a rich, varying one. In physics, a constant signal carries very little information. It tells you almost nothing about the system. But a changing signal can encode patterns, shifts, disturbances. Your artery cells are, in a way, interpreting a signal, not consciously but physically. When the signal becomes too simple, too steady, they adjust their behavior. They begin to act as if something is missing, and in a sense, something is. The complexity of motion that your body quietly expects is no longer there. Now return to the simple act of sitting, but look at it with this new lens. You lower yourself into a chair, your legs bend, your weight settles, and within seconds your muscles become quiet. Not completely inactive, but far less engaged than when you are standing or moving. The large muscles in your legs, normally responsible for rhythmically contracting and assisting circulation, are now mostly still. This matters more than it first appears. Those muscle contractions are not just for movement, they act like auxiliary pumps, gently squeezing veins and helping push blood back toward the heart. When they stop contracting regularly, that assistance fades. Blood flow doesn't stop, but its pattern changes, especially in the lower part of your body. The flow becomes slower, less variable, more uniform. And now we can connect this directly to what we discussed earlier. With less movement, the shear stress along the walls of your arteries begins to drop. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to change the signal those endothelial cells are receiving. The rich, fluctuating pattern of forces becomes flatter, simpler. It's like listening to music that suddenly loses all variation and turns into a single sustained note. The note is still there, but something important is missing. Inside your arteries, that missing variation has consequences. The endothelial cells begin to shift their behavior. One of the first measurable changes is a reduction in the production of nitric oxide. This molecule plays a quiet but essential role. It tells the surrounding smooth muscle in the artery wall to relax, allowing the vessel to widen when needed. With less nitric oxide, the artery becomes slightly less responsive. Not stiff in an obvious way, not blocked, but less capable of adjusting quickly. At the same time, other subtle signals begin to change. Some of them are associated with increased constriction, others with inflammation-related pathways. These are not dramatic responses, they are small adjustments in chemical balance. But they are real. To make this more intuitive, imagine a busy workplace where people are constantly exchanging information. When communication is active and varied, the system runs smoothly. Problems are noticed early, adjustments happen quickly. Now imagine that communication becomes minimal. Messages are fewer, less detailed, less frequent. The system doesn't collapse, but it becomes less responsive, less adaptive. That's a useful way to think about what's happening here. There's another effect worth considering. When blood flow slows, the interaction between its components changes slightly. Red blood cells, platelets, and other anocer in the blood have more time to interact with each other and with the vessel wall. The flow is still continuous, but the balance between movement and interaction shifts. Think again of traffic. At higher speeds, cars spend less time next to each other. Interactions are brief. But when traffic slows, vehicles cluster more closely, and the probability of small disruptions increases. Not accidents necessarily, just a greater sensitivity to disturbance. Your bloodstream behaves in an analogous way. During 1 hour of sitting, none of these changes are extreme. You won't feel them. There is no immediate warning signal, no discomfort that tells you something is happening. And that's precisely what makes this phenomenon difficult to grasp. Because from your perspective, nothing has changed. But from the perspective of physics and biology, the entire environment inside your arteries has shifted, quietly, continuously, into a slightly different state. Now we arrive at a question that sounds simple, but is surprisingly difficult to answer with precision. What actually happens over the course of 1 hour? Not in a general sense, not in vague terms, but specifically, physically, measurably. If you take a person, have them sit still, and observe their arteries using modern techniques, you begin to see patterns. Not dramatic events, not sudden failures, just subtle, consistent shifts. Blood flow in the legs decreases. This is one of the most reliable observations. Without regular muscle contractions to assist circulation, Less blood is pushed through certain regions, particularly in the lower body. The heart is still doing its job, but the distribution and character of flow change. As this happens, shear stress along the arterial walls declines. The force created by blood sliding along the endothelium becomes weaker and less variable. This is not a guess. We can measure it indirectly through flow velocity and vessel diameter. And then something even more interesting happens. The arteries become slightly less responsive. Scientists often test this using a method called flow-mediated dilation. In simple terms, they temporarily restrict blood flow in a limb, then release it and observe how well the artery expands in response. Under healthy conditions, the artery widens noticeably, driven largely by nitric oxide signaling. But after prolonged sitting, sometimes as little as an hour, the degree of expansion is reduced. Not gone, not broken, just diminished. It's as if the artery hesitates. This tells us something important. The endothelial cells are not behaving in exactly the same way as they were before. Now here is where honesty becomes essential. We understand these short-term effects fairly well. They've been observed across multiple studies under controlled conditions, but when we ask a deeper question, what do these changes mean over time? The answers become less clear. Does 1 hour matter on its own? Probably not in any lasting way. Stand up, walk around, restore movement, and many of these changes reverse. Blood flow increases again, shear stress rises, nitric oxide production improves, the system appears to recover. But this leads to a more subtle and difficult question. What if this pattern repeats, day after day, year after year? Short periods of reduced responsiveness followed by recovery. Again and again. At what point do temporary changes begin to leave a lasting imprint? This is where science becomes less certain. We suspect that repeated exposure to low shear conditions may contribute to long-term changes in the structure and function of arteries. There is evidence linking prolonged sedentary behavior with cardiovascular disease. But the exact chain of events, from 1 hour of sitting to decades of vascular change, is not fully mapped. There are too many variables. Different people respond differently. Age, genetics, fitness level, diet, even hydration, all influence how the system behaves. Two individuals can sit for the same amount of time and experience slightly different internal effects. And there's another complication: scale. The changes we're talking about occur at a microscopic and molecular level. They are small, gradual, and distributed throughout a vast network. There is no single moment where something clearly goes wrong. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of tiny shifts. This makes the phenomenon difficult not only to study, but to truly understand in an intuitive way. Because human intuition is not built for this kind of process. We are good at noticing sudden changes, pain, pressure, movement. But we are not designed to perceive slow, silent alterations in internal conditions. So when you sit for an hour, your experience tells you nothing happened, but measurement tells a different story. Something did happen, not dramatic, not irreversible, but real. A small temporary change in how your arteries function, one that disappears when conditions change, yet raises deeper questions about what happens when those conditions repeat over a lifetime. There is a deeper difficulty here, and it has less to do with arteries themselves and more to do with the limits of human understanding. You are trying to make sense of something that operates on scales you cannot directly experience. Not just small in size, but subtle in effect and slow in consequence. Your senses are tuned for survival in a very immediate world. Sharp changes, clear signals, things that demand attention. But the processes inside your arteries do not announce themselves in that way. You do not feel shear stress. You do not sense nitric oxide levels rising or falling. You cannot detect the moment an endothelial cell slightly changes its behavior. And because you cannot feel these things, your brain naturally assumes they are not important. This is a kind of perceptual bias. If something does not produce a sensation, it feels as though it does not exist, or at least that it does not matter. But physics does not care about perception. A force exists whether you feel it or not. A change in flow matters whether it produces a sensation or remains completely silent. This creates a gap between reality and experience. To understand this gap, imagine shrinking yourself down to the scale of a single cell inside an artery. Now the world looks very different. What once seemed like calm, steady flow might appear as a complex, shifting environment of forces and interactions. Small changes in velocity or direction would feel significant, even dramatic. At that scale, sitting for an hour would not look like nothing happening. It would look like a clear alteration in conditions, a change in the forces acting on you, a change in the signals you receive from your surroundings. But at your normal scale, none of this is visible, so your intuition fails. There is another layer to this problem: time. The most important effects are not only small, they are cumulative. They build gradually, through repetition. 1 hour blends into another, one day into the next, until patterns form, not through a single event, but through accumulation. Humans are not naturally good at understanding cumulative processes unless they are obvious. If you drop a glass, it breaks instantly. That's easy to grasp. But if something changes by a tiny fraction each hour, the mind struggles to track it. It's like trying to notice the motion of a clock's hour hand. At any given moment, it appears still. Only by stepping back and comparing across long intervals do you recognize that it has moved. The same is true here. Each hour of sitting produces a small shift. Then the system resets, partially or fully, when you move again. But over time, these repeated shifts may begin to influence baseline behavior. The difficulty is that there is no clear boundary, no sharp line where you can say, now the system has changed permanently. Instead, there is a gradual drift, and this drift is influenced by countless interacting factors: genetics, environment, habits, age. The arteries are not isolated components. They are part of a deeply interconnected system. Changes in one part can influence others in ways that are difficult to trace. This is why, even with advanced tools and careful experiments, there are still gaps in our understanding. We can measure flow, we can observe responses, we can identify correlations. But connecting all the dots, from a single hour of sitting to long-term outcomes, requires navigating a web of interactions that is extraordinarily complex. And so we are left in an interesting position. We know enough to say that something real is happening. We know enough to measure its short-term effects. But we do not know enough to describe the full story with complete certainty. This is not a weakness of science. It is a reflection of the kind of system we are dealing with. One that is dynamic, adaptive, and sensitive to conditions we can barely perceive. And perhaps the most important realization is this: your understanding of your own body is limited not because the body is mysterious in some mystical sense, but because it operates in domains your senses were never designed to access. So when you sit and feel nothing, that feeling of nothing is not an observation of reality, it is an absence of perception. There is a strange tension in all of this, and it becomes clearer the longer you think about it. On one hand, sitting feels like rest. It feels like doing less, using less energy, placing fewer demands on the body. In everyday language, we even treat sitting as a break from activity, as if the body enters a kind of neutral state where nothing much is required. But when you look at the physics and biology more carefully, that idea begins to fall apart. Sitting is not a neutral state. It is a very specific set of conditions imposed on a complex system. Your joints are held at fixed angles. Large muscle groups are mostly inactive. Blood flow patterns shift, especially in the lower body. The forces acting on artery walls change. Signals that depend on movement become weaker or disappear. This is not the absence of influence. It is a different kind of influence. To make sense of this, it helps to step away from the body for a moment and think about systems in general. Imagine a musical instrument, a violin for example. If you play it, the strings vibrate, producing a rich range of frequencies. The instrument is active, responding to input, adjusting to subtle variations in how it's played. Now imagine you stop playing, but instead of letting the instrument rest completely, you hold one string under constant, unchanging tension. No variation, no movement, just a steady force applied over time. The system is not being used in the dynamic sense it was designed for. It is being held in a constrained, simplified state. Your arteries experience something analogous. They evolved under conditions of frequent movement, walking, lifting, shifting, changing posture. Under those conditions, blood flow is rarely constant. It pulses, varies, accelerates, decelerates. The shear stress on artery walls rises and falls in complex patterns. That variability is not noise, it is part of the normal operating environment. When you sit for long periods, you remove much of that variability. You create a more uniform, less dynamic flow pattern. From a purely energetic perspective, this might seem like less work. But from the perspective of a system that depends on variation to regulate itself, it is closer to understimulation. And understimulation has consequences. Not immediate, dramatic consequences, but subtle ones. The endothelial cells receive a weaker signal. Chemical responses shift slightly. The balance between dilation and constriction changes. The system becomes less responsive, less adaptive, in that moment. This leads to an interesting paradox. What feels like rest to you may not be rest in the way your arteries expect rest to behave. True rest, in a biological sense, does not necessarily mean the absence of activity. It often means a balance. A state where systems can recover while still receiving enough input to maintain their function. In contrast, prolonged stillness creates a kind of sensory deprivation for certain internal processes. You can see similar effects in other parts of biology. Muscles that are not used begin to weaken. Neural circuits that are not engaged can lose efficiency. Systems adapt not only to what is present, but also to what is absent. Your arteries are no exception. They are constantly adjusting to the signals they receive. When those signals become simpler, weaker, or less varied, the adjustment reflects that. There is no alarm that goes off, no immediate discomfort that forces you to respond. The change is quiet, almost invisible. And that is what makes it so easy to misunderstand, because in everyday experience we associate importance with sensation. If something matters, we expect to feel it. If we feel nothing, we assume nothing important is happening. But here, the opposite is true. The absence of sensation is precisely what allows these subtle shifts to occur unnoticed. So sitting is not simply doing nothing. It is placing your body into a particular physical regime, one defined by reduced movement, altered flow, and diminished variation. And your arteries, like any responsive system, adapt to that regime in real time, whether you are aware of it or not. Now consider a different kind of question, one that is less about what happens in a single moment, and more about how moments connect to each other. If 1 hour produces a small, temporary change, and that change disappears when you move, then it is tempting to conclude that it doesn't really matter. The system resets, the arteries recover, everything returns to baseline. But this way of thinking assumes that each hour exists in isolation. In reality, it doesn't. Your body is not a system that resets to a perfect starting point every time conditions change. It carries traces of its past, not always in obvious ways, but in subtle adjustments to how it behaves, how it responds, and what it considers normal. So instead of asking what 1 hour does, it may be more useful to ask what happens when similar conditions repeat over and over again. Imagine a path across a field. The first time you walk across it, nothing changes. The grass bends slightly, then springs back. The second time, the same thing happens. But after many repetitions, days, weeks, months, the grass begins to wear down. A faint trail appears. No single step created the path. The path emerged from repetition. Something similar may be happening inside your arteries. Each period of sitting introduces a temporary shift, reduced shear stress, altered signaling, slightly decreased responsiveness. Then movement restores more favorable conditions, and much of the system recovers. But if the periods of reduced stimulation occur frequently enough, the balance between reduced and restored begins to shift. The baseline itself may slowly adjust. This is where the concept of adaptation becomes important. Biological systems are not static. They continuously adapt to the environments they experience most often. If a certain condition repeats frequently, the system begins to treat it as normal. So if low variation blood flow becomes a common state, hours each day, over many years, the arteries may gradually adjust to that pattern. Not abruptly, not in a clearly defined moment, but through incremental changes in structure and function. This might involve changes in how endothelial cells respond to shear stress, alterations in the balance of signaling molecules, gradual shifts in the mechanical properties of the vessel wall. These are not speculative ideas in the sense of being invented, but they are not fully mapped either. We see pieces of the puzzle, associations between sedentary behavior and vascular disease, measurable differences in arterial function, but the complete chain of cause and effect is still being assembled. There are also competing influences. Movement, even in small amounts, can reverse some of the short-term effects. A brief walk can increase blood flow, restore shear stress, and improve endothelial function. This suggests that the system is not only adaptive, but also responsive to relatively small changes in behavior. So the outcome is not determined by sitting alone, but by the pattern in which sitting and movement are distributed over time. This makes the problem more complex, not less. It's not a simple equation where a certain number of hours automatically leads to a specific result. It's a dynamic balance between opposing conditions, periods of low stimulation and periods of renewed activity. And within that balance, individual differences play a role. Some people may be more resilient, their systems recovering quickly and fully. Others may experience more persistent effects. The reasons for these differences are not completely understood. What we are left with is a picture that is incomplete but informative. We know that the body responds to repeated conditions. We know that small temporary changes can accumulate. We know that patterns over time shape biological systems, but we do not have a precise formula that tells us exactly when or how these accumulated changes cross into lasting structural differences. And this uncertainty is not a gap to be ignored. It is part of the reality. Because the most important processes in living systems often do not reveal themselves in single events, but in patterns that only become visible when you look across long stretches of time. If you follow this line of thinking all the way through, it begins to change how you interpret not just sitting, but experience itself. You start with a simple observation. You sit for an hour and you feel nothing unusual, no signal, no discomfort, no clear indication that anything meaningful has changed. From the point of view of your conscious awareness, the hour passes almost as if it left no trace. But when you look beneath that layer of perception, a different picture emerges. Forces have shifted, flows have changed, cells have adjusted their behavior, not dramatically, not irreversibly, but measurably. So you are confronted with two versions of reality. One is the reality you experience directly, quiet, uneventful, seemingly static. The other is the physical reality, dynamic, responsive, continuously evolving. And these two realities do not align very well. This mismatch is not unique to arteries. It is a general feature of how humans interact with the world. Your senses evolved to detect changes that matter for immediate survival. Sharp pain, sudden motion, loud sounds. They are not designed to reveal slow, distributed, microscopic processes. As a result, much of what is most important operates below the threshold of awareness. This creates an interesting philosophical problem. If a change occurs that you cannot perceive, in what sense is it part of your experience? From a scientific perspective, the answer is straightforward. It is part of reality, regardless of whether you perceive it. The forces acting on your arteries, the signals exchanged between cells, the gradual adjustments in function, all of these exist independently of your awareness. But from a human perspective, there is a gap. You live inside a filtered version of reality, one that emphasizes certain signals and ignores others. And this filtering is not neutral. It shapes how you think, how you decide, and how you understand cause and effect. When you sit and feel nothing, your mind concludes that nothing important is happening. That conclusion feels reasonable because it is consistent with your perception, but it is not necessarily consistent with the underlying physics. This leads to a deeper insight. Absence of evidence in your senses is not evidence of absence in the system. The body continues to operate according to physical laws whether or not you are aware of it. Shear stress changes whether or not you can feel it. Chemical signals rise and fall without announcing themselves, and over long periods of time, these unnoticed processes can shape outcomes in ways that seem disconnected from your immediate experience. This is one reason why cause and effect can feel so difficult to trace in biological systems. The causes are often small, distributed, and delayed. The effects appear much later, sometimes in forms that are not obviously linked to the original conditions, so the mind struggles to connect them. It prefers simple, immediate relationships. This action leads to that result. But in systems like the human body, the relationships are often indirect and cumulative. Sitting for 1 hour does not produce a visible outcome. Sitting for thousands of hours over many years might contribute to changes that eventually become noticeable. But by that point, the connection between cause and effect is no longer obvious. And so the story becomes fragmented. You remember the present moment, comfortable, uneventful, harmless. But the system remembers the pattern. Repeated, cumulative, influential. In this way, your arteries are part of a larger lesson about reality itself. They remind you that what you experience is only a thin slice of what is actually happening. That the most important changes are often the ones you cannot feel. And that understanding the world, whether inside your body or outside it, requires looking beyond intuition, beyond immediate perception, into processes that unfold quietly, continuously, and without asking for your attention.